Welcome, fellow Rotarians and guests, to this Monday, May 24th Rotary meeting. We will begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everybody. Before I ask Rotarian Kurt Lombeck to come up and say today's invocation, thought I'd bring to the club's attention, and I think about this through the lens of service above self. Longtime Rotarian Monsignor James Michael Doyle passed away this morning. And as I prepared, and I just heard about this a few minutes ago, and as I was trying to come up with the right things to say, I thought I would go to the worthy and appropriate South Dakota Hall of Fame, where Senior Doyle was a member. His three accomplishments that give him the greatest satisfaction. The first is bringing university students through the Vietnam era and teaching them through an academic and faith-based approach that the church is not irrelevant. The second thing is founding St. Michael Parish in Sioux Falls, the largest church of any denomination in South Dakota. And third, establishing with other denominations an ecumenical outreach to the poor. And when you think about service above self, longtime Rotarian Doyle certainly lived up to that. May I now ask for a moment of silence as we recognize him. Thank you. I'd like to now invite up Kurt Lombeck, who will say today's invocation.
Can you bow your heads, please? Dear Lord, it is good to recognize how different we are, our talents, our dreams, our backgrounds, our occupations. And it is good to know that when you created each of us, you broke the mold. No one is exactly like anyone else. Even our thumbprint and our voice track tell us how unique we are. Yet we thank you that we can take these differences and mobilize them for the good of Rotary and our community. In our differences, we can think the same thoughts and move together toward a common goal. Bless us as we meet together. Thank you for our individuality and also for our common bond. And thank you for bringing Monsignor Doyle home. Amen.
Thank you, Kurt. You may be seated. All right. I would like to now ask all of our guests or folks who are visiting from other clubs to please stand and be recognized, if you would, please. I know you're out there. There we go. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. We greatly appreciate it. Okay, we do have one new member induction, and the proposer, Tony Knorr, was unable to make it last minute today, so I will help in this effort. Daniel Hagar, Minnehaha County State's Attorney, is married to his wife Jennifer, and they have 3 kids, and I apologize that I cannot add more, but now you have more curriculum that you can kind of work through, so come on up here, sir.
It's always dangerous giving a lawyer and someone who's holding public office an open mic. And so I thank you for that opportunity. I suppose you only make certain mistakes one time. This maybe is that. Very glad to be joining this group. I respect just the leadership, the mentoring, the conversations that they're having. Very glad to be here and be a part of it. Growing up in this community, you recognize that there are people who you want to join and be on their side and have them on yours. And this is that group. You know, as I have moved into this role as state's attorney, you realize that there are going to be issues and challenges that you can't tackle alone. And when I look around this room and talk with each of you, I know that this is a group that it's important to have tackling those challenges with you. Grew up in Sioux Falls, attended the University of Sioux Falls, University of South Dakota School of Law. My wife Jennifer and I have 3 kids, so we love just experiencing everything that this community has. Look forward to getting to know each and all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Welcome to the club. We look forward to getting to know you in the future more. All right. We're now moving into the program. 1 year ago, the tragedy that occurred in Minneapolis, Minnesota, struck a chord with all of us, struck a chord across the country and across the globe. Shortly thereafter, these two gentlemen that you see here, Vaney Hariri and Lieutenant John Thum, joined us at downtown Rotary in a virtual conversation. And a year later, here we are. A lot of changes have been taking place, and the conversation continues. And I want to thank Vaney Hariri and Lieutenant John Thum for joining us today to fill us in on where we are and where we're going. So, Vaney, Lieutenant Thum.
Well, first thing, just to set the stage just a bit. So when we had this conversation, tomorrow will mark the anniversary of the death of George Floyd, which precipitated our conversation to a degree. And this weekend will mark the anniversary of the march that happened, which is where I kind of joined the conversation that way. With all that was happening and all the energy that was going on in our community, we knew we needed to have a conversation. And many times when we talk about these uncomfortable things like race, like justice, like equity, we can easily get the feeling that we're exhausted by these conversations. And what I believe it is that most people are exhausted in having these conversations in a less than productive way, in a way that doesn't actually move us forward. I think many people are willing to have the conversation as long as they know that it's going to do some good. And that's the type of conversation that we wanted to have. And so John being a friend of mine, we've known each other for quite some time. It just made sense for us to have this conversation. As far as the Rotary is concerned, one of the other things that we were talking about that time is the programming and what it looked like. And one of the things that we just kind of decided is that we didn't want to just be the place where the important people are, but rather we wanted to be a place where the important conversations happen, right? That is the true burden of leadership, is that there has to be a place, there has to be a group of people who are promoting these type of conversations, who are willing to, be in these kind of challenging dynamics, so that way we could do what's best for our community. So a lot of respect for our leadership within Rotary, and a lot of respect to you all for supporting this type of programming and really tuning in and engaging and being willing to let this dialogue happen in a place such as this. So I'm excited for that. So in terms of the conversation, just to get it started, and this is what this would be a conversation. We'll do our best to try to save a little time for maybe a question or two at the end, but we want to dialogue a little bit. And I think it might be important just to set the stage, because this was last year was a big week.
Yeah.
Particularly for PD.
Yeah. So, and I think back to the point that we had that first initial conversation. On a side note, it's great to actually see people.
Yes.
As far as I knew,
Give it up for that.
As far as I knew, the Rotary was just a camera that I talked to with this guy, so we did something like that. So it's very, I was like, hey, this is in person. This is going to be great to have this in person, because as Vaney said, these conversations that we all need to be having. But yeah, it was a big week, and everything that was kind of going through the country, and then we looked at what was happening here locally, and I think there was just so much. It seemed like there was so much at stake, right? Mm-hmm. There was so much at stake for the community across the board, and I know immediately after the original George Floyd incident, we as a department even were analyzing that incident, putting it out to our officers, and each officer actually was part of a lineup training, watched it, and we dissected it from a policy and procedure standpoint, from best practices, and then leading up to the protest and reaching out with the organizers, with community advocates' help to make sure that was successful and to make sure everything fell in line and everything went in place. And I think there was so much weight and pressure, I think even on the police department, the community, that this was going to go off without a hitch, right? That everything was going to happen, and that we were going to be this shining example in Sioux Falls that, you know, nothing bad has to happen, right? Right. As places around the country had their issues, no, we weren't going to have that here, and then it did, which we talked about, and I remember leading up afterwards. Then after that conversation that you and I were going to have, it seemed just so heavy.
Yeah.
Right. It just seems so heavy because we were like, well, where do we go from here, and what steps do we take as a community? And I'm not necessarily talking as a police officer just at this moment, just as a human being and a lifelong resident of Sioux Falls who's deeply invested and cares about the community. I'm like, where do we go from here? And I think that Rotary facilitating that first conversation, and I'm like, well, who's going to watch this?
Yeah.
Right. Like, do people care?
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. Yeah. And then all of a sudden started realizing, hey, I became, for us, just not for me. Oh yeah, weren't you on the news at one time?
Yeah.
No, I saw you on the Rotary thing.
Yeah.
And I saw this here and in this conversation, and kind of even, it just became a really interesting week, I should say. I don't even of that went forward, but I don't know if you were.
Well, it was interesting because for me, you know, I felt the natural, the emotions that a Black man would feel watching that video. And so there was some processing that had to happen for me in general. But one of the things that I think oftentimes people don't appreciate for someone that might be in this position, and there's many people who have been doing this type of work in some type of way, is that you have to activate before you get to go through a natural process of trying to understand what it is that you're going through. And I say that in the legacy of people who have done so much more than me and experienced so much more than I have. So in that week, you know, it was just a heavy week in general, but then there was just this urgency to do something, right? And but at the same time, you have to consider about all the ways that this can go south, especially based off of what we were seeing in the national picture. And I think we both, I don't want to speak for you, but at least for me, I knew it was one of those situations where the dialogue had to start really quickly in terms of how we felt about things, and to make sure that people knew that there were people. And one of the things I even hate when people frame this is on both sides of it. Like there are no sides to it. You know what I mean? Like there's not like we're over here and the police are over there. That's not what it is. It's a situation where our community was experiencing something in a way that it had never experienced it before, and we had to try to get ahead of it and have that conversation. So that's where my mind was at that week. Where was your mind at?
You bring up a good point. Both sides, as if somehow we are adversarial.
Yeah.
Because of these lines that society has drawn. Like I think that's a really good point. And in my mind too, is like I think, you know, in my mind I felt like we've done some work, we've done some outreach, we've been in the community. And me had invested in numerous opportunities throughout the community, and somewhat personally, I felt so invested that anything that would go bad would be a reflection and a failure on us as a community, right? And so I think that's where my mind was at, like, oh, if this goes bad, this reflects on all of us.
Yeah.
And like we didn't do enough, and we should have done more in this. And I think coming through it, and then even I think right before it, in the day of, you and I had phone calls or conversations. You know, I'm like, where are we at? Do things look good? I mean, we're trying to get this arranged. And I remember being at the courthouse step, and people were speaking up there, and I could see you up there and a few other people that I knew. And somebody came up and tried to get the crowd riled up, and the speakers on stage just kicked the person off. Like there was just everything was going so well. And I think it became, again, even as we're working through this as a community, we're still communicating, we're still dialoguing, even on that day, on how we can make this impactful and important for as many people as possible. Because it is our goal. That's the goal, is to make this an impactful experience for everybody. Yeah.
I think that's important context to let people know what was kind of happening that day. I think as much as we talk about the opportunities that we have, one of the challenges is that when you have these conversations, they naturally start to happen in the context of the national conversation, right? Which is not necessarily what's happening here It's not the same experience that we're having. That's not to say that I'm not in solidarity. That's not to say that I don't feel what people feel. That's not to say any of those things, but it was a little bit different. And so I do want to point out a couple of things that happened that day that are probably different than a lot of communities, so people understand that we're not starting from scratch.
Yeah.
When we're talking about these type of things. I had a conversation with one of our resource officers, Officer Lewin here, and he called and said, hey, we see that there's some marches that are being planned and they don't have permits. We want to make sure that you get the permits that you need, so there's no reason for us to have to, get in the way of whatever it is that you're doing. That's one thing that's not happening in a lot of communities. Most people will let it go without having a permit, so they have a reason to do something with it. Our police department reached out and said, hey, can we do that? And I'm a part of the community ambassador program. And so I try to participate in some of the things, understand some of the policies and the different procedures and strategies that are happening so that I could be a conduit for, the greater public. And so we had that connection because of that program where we was able to call me and I was able to call the organizers and make sure people had the permits that they needed in order for this to even happen. That afternoon before the conversation, we had some really young organizers that weren't very experienced. So they reached out to some other folks that were more experienced, myself and Julian Beauwan, two folks, for example. And we had a conversation that afternoon with the mayor, the Chief Burns, and Sheriff Milstead. That's something that doesn't really happen. And there was dialogue there. We went and it was a pretty solid day. You and I were talking during the course of the day. That's something that doesn't typically happen. And then we had a peaceful gathering of 4,000-ish people, which is something that has never happened. And the energy was good. And I remember we kind of moved it around to the law enforcement center. And I kind of was like, all right, this event is done. Okay, so we're done with this event. But as we know, the story, things carried on and kind of moved throughout the city, moved down 41st and eventually made their way to the mall. And that's kind of where my, night kind of cut off and yours kind of kicked up. And so I can talk about a little bit later the emotions that I was going through in terms of speaking in front of that audience of 4,000 people. But I think the one that had the most pressure was probably your piece of it.
Yeah, and so it got to that point, and I'm actually not going to dwell on it too much because it was very well publicized, and I don't think it's something. But again, it's talked about the community, and even in that moment where things completely lost their minds a bit, and you realize things have lost their minds a little bit when there's giant rocks coming at your head. I guess one of those epiphany, you don't need that at that moment. But immediately when that happened, still there was 20 to 30 people who immediately formed a line in front of us.
Yeah.
Right. And immediately started to try to protect the officers that were there. And in that moment of that, I'm like, well, this is one of the enduring moments I'll take from that incident, right?
Yeah.
And then there's going to be some other things that are happening that are going to be not so pleasant and that we're going to have to work through and deal with. And there's still some stuff pending on that, but that's the moment I choose to grab. And even, I still maybe somewhat foolishly thought that because of that group and because of the other people who were there, that this was all going to stop, right? Mm-hmm. Because we thought we had done enough work beforehand. We thought we'd had enough conversations, enough inroads that this may be enough to kind of put a stop to that before it got a little out of hand, right? And that's just not what took place. And then things went from there. And from a law enforcement standpoint, there's a way things need to be dealt with. And I feel we dealt with them appropriately and brought that to a conclusion. And I still remember when it was all done, it was like 4 a.m, the incredible sense of calm. The city just went quiet. Yeah. Just absolutely quiet. And then waking up the next morning and like, well, where do we go from here? Yeah. And that's what the mindset was immediately, is like, where do we go from here? Yeah. And the agency's like, where are we going to go? And the community says, where do we go from here? And people just in general, like, yeah, this is not going to be that part of it is not going to be what defines this event. Yeah. Right. I mean, where we're going is where it's going to be.
It was super eerie. I remember I got a call just before midnight to come and do an interview, kind of framing what was happening at the time. And so I remember coming in and talking about it and seeing that how many young people were out there, you know, kids that coach football, kids that do all these other type of things. And you know, you're talking about what's happening and you're trying to represent the reality of what's going on in your own community without losing the context of why these things are happening, right? Which often happens. You know what I mean? We often shift the attention, you know, to the thing that happened last or is most sensational, and we don't really take care of the root cause of it. And then I'm walking home just a little bit past midnight, and I see, you know, some National Guard folks, you know, drive by. And it's like, you know, and we had folks in front of shops with long guns and patrolling streets and all of these other type of things. And one of the things that's just something that I felt before, but was just so much more pronounced that night, was just that when we look at Minneapolis or what has happened in any other places in the country where it got really dangerous, you just really have to own the fact that we are not special. We're early, you know, and that if the same sequence of things happen with 200,000 more people, if those things happen with the 40% of diversity that we have in our schools fully realized, when we have the migration patterns that we have, 5,000 people a year, many of those people coming from some of these environments where they don't have these healthy relationships with their police department, that we're not immune to that thing. And it's very, very, very real. And then I thought about, like, how would we hold up to that if national news media converged on us and people from all across the nation converged on this community, on our downtown is still mostly one street. You know what I mean? What does that look like? And so for me, it was scary to one degree, but the other thing was it was motivating in terms of what are we going to do? Like, what are we going to do about it? You know, because a lot of times we cop out and we go back to our thing and we try to explain it with a meme or some quippy little line or a tweet that encapsulates it. Because even for me that day, when I was asked to speak to this audience, for a lot of people, they say, big deal. I've spoken in front of and performed in front of thousands of people before, so that wasn't a big deal for me. What was interesting for me was, and what was challenging for me that day is that everyone that I had ever seen that is really in my mind that stood atop of steps and talked to, all of these type of people about this subject matter. Actually, I mean, again, whatever about it. All of the people that I had seen in my life that occupied that space were assassinated. Yeah, it was heavy.
Yeah. And I think, and just reflecting on even this moment, right? We talked about conversations and about stuff that maybe we don't always understand based on what our perspective is, right? And one of the things I think I've learned most from my conversations, particularly with Vaney, is if I don't listen to what's being said and take it for his experience and from where he's at, or we take this and take it out to the community, if we're not listening to somebody's feelings or thoughts on things, how can we ever really have a conversation if we just stay entrenched in ideals or our perspectives or our echo chamber, right? If we're not listening to never in my mind would the perspective be that, oh yeah, that's what was going through Vaney's head at that moment, right? Meanwhile, I'm just thinking about, where is everybody? How do I keep track of this? Right. And how can I keep this moment under control from my perspective, right? And I think maybe people don't understand law enforcement's number one goal of any event is to have nothing happen.
Yeah.
we like to get paid the same amount of money for little work.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. And in
So-
that space, that's what we want you thinking about.
Yeah. So when your business is chaos,
Yeah.
right? You don't want it, right?
Yeah.
And I tell this to the SWAT team commander, and we do a lot of active shooter training and a lot of different stuff. It's like you have to understand that you train for this ultimate event, this Super Bowl, so to speak,
Yeah.
but you never want to play in it. Like you never want to play in that game. That's what you train for, but you never want to be in it. It's an odd paradox of how law enforcement thinks sometimes, because we want, I want calm, right? And that's kind of what I want. But we talk about where do we go from here and the events but moving forward is like usually when at a point where these events happen, right? And it's usually chaotic. A lot of times there's chaos. I look at that as the tip of the pyramid in both these paths, and it's often focused on law enforcement, right?
Mhm.
Because usually what's the flashpoint? It's law enforcement's interaction with people. Well, these two lines started very far apart and converged at that point. And between all those points, there's numerous things, numerous interactions that can happen, and numerous things we can do to keep those two lines from converging into chaos. Is my visual picture that I put into things.
That's so real. It's lots and lots and lots and lots of touch points.
Yeah.
You know, and that's one of the things that we try to draw out in our conversation. And I think as we just move forward past that particular day, and we talk about, what we've been trying to do going forward, that was one of the big things, is saying that, that moment in time, and well, in this particular instance, moments in time, is tragic and all of those other type of things, but there's so many things that lead to those points. How we deal with people in our community, how we provide resources for people, how we build them up, how we develop them, how we manage, and assist in mental health, what we ask our police to do and how much and what is reasonable, and how do we develop and prepare the people, and how do we support these conversations, and how do we do accountability in a healthy way? There's so many points. And oftentimes what feels frustrating is just a lack of urgency to manage any of those things. And we arrive at the same place. It's funny because a lot of the things that I'm on, it's you always got to have try to have a long-term plan. And sometimes whenever you're doing a long-term plan, or whenever you're trying to bring something to market or do whatever in any type of business sense, you're afraid of missing a moment. But the sick part about it is that you know that there'll always be another one. It's like, we didn't get this out now, but give it a couple weeks, another video will drop and you can use it then. And so you wanted to have some urgency. We wanted to have some things happen. And from that, there's a few things happen. The South Dakota Justice and Equity Coalition formed, and there's initiatives that are happening there. The Sioux Falls Leadership Council developed some community roundtables where we brought folks together from a lot of different intersections to be able to talk about things that they wanted for their community. And from that, a community group is developed where now they're thinking through different things that they can do to affect the community. And all of that is great. But this is one of those things where there's so many things that have to be pushed and moved, that this is just not one of those things where you get to let someone else fix it.
No.
This is an all hands on deck type of thing.
And we love easy answers, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I'll speak from a law enforcement perspective, right? Yeah. This will solve everything.
Yeah.
Right. It's a body cam. So you're all being videoed while I do this. No, you're not really. Right? But we just wear it all the time, right? It's always on, and everybody's like, okay, this is what we need to make things more clear, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is going to help everything. And I'll tell you, from me, they're awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I had somebody call about a traffic stop complaint the other day. I'm like, great, give me the details. I'll be watching the video within a minute. Like, literally, I will be watching the video within a minute. Like, it's a great way to deal with all the different aspects that are there, right? In Sioux Falls Police Department in the city made a huge commitment, and it's not cheap because the cameras, the storage, everything that goes along with it. But it was really a reasonable request that people wanted to see, But it doesn't necessarily solve anything overnight. It's just one piece for police accountability that people want to see. It's one thing that we really want, but you're always be clamoring for the next thing that's going to just be maybe the magic easy button.
For
that
sure.
We can throw some money at it, right? We can throw some money at it. We can do this. We can all these things. But again, there's multiple facets to what we have to do moving forward. And every little change the police department makes, within the past year, we have a social justice section on our website. We've done a series of videos addressing commonly asked questions about police. We've instituted a formal duty to intervene policy, even though it was already in our policy. We carved it out to make sure that's there. We tried to look at everything, a policy review that started before the George Floyd incident that happens biannually through LLRMI, that we go through every single policy, make sure it's up to everything that we need to be. But ultimately, like you said, if the next thing happens, the next video happens, people will be mildly interested about all those topics, right? It'll be a nice talking point. It'll be some good things to look at. It's things we absolutely have to do to make sure we're on industry best standards. That's our job as the police department, to make sure we're doing industry best standards. But ultimately, this is a bigger issue than just the cops and just people. It's community, society as a whole. And we sometimes forget, I didn't make this up, the 4 C's, right? There's cops, courts, corrections, but the 4th C is community.
Yep.
And that's really where it starts.
Yeah.
And once we kind of get to cops, courts, and corrections, now we're in a lot harder, sometimes waters to navigate. Yeah.
There's a lot to...
There's a storm there at that point.
To reimagine and think about there. I mean, and it's always so strange to me. It's always so interesting because it seems like there's always a conflict about whether or not we should do something versus what it is that we should do. And I think that's always so strange to me, being that no segment of the population is satisfied with the status quo. The police friends I have are not satisfied with it. The general public are not satisfied with it. People of color are not satisfied with it. I don't know anyone that is satisfied with the energy that has happened. I think about my LEO friends, and I can't think about a time where they were less safe. And so if you come from that perspective, I don't know how people are comfortable with this. Driving with a broken taillight is a thing for me. You know what I mean? Like, that's a real thing. And that has nothing to do with like my personal interaction with you or I. Like, there's only so many times I can see something like that happen and see a uniform attached to it and not have that same anxiety despite who's in it, unless I know who's in the uniform. And that's hard to do because we have to have 1,000 of you guys out there, because you might have to go have the conversation with somebody about their neighbor's lawn being too long and they don't want to do it themselves. So that's one of the things that I want to talk about, because one of the things that came out of it is this idea of defund the police. Now, that's, for many people, can't get past that terminology, and it was probably a real inartful way of saying it. And I think sometimes people get confused that, like, I think they think that there's like a meeting where people get together and be like, we'll call it this. That's not what happens. Somebody calls it something.
Yeah. And then somebody decides that sounds all right.
Yeah.
Let's roll with that.
And then everybody, everybody else is managing. And then somebody else says,
oh, that sounds pretty polarizing. Let's run with it.
Right.
Because then we can get people to dig into their camps a little bit harder.
It makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah.
But what it comes down to, though, in its genesis is, do we have officers doing more than what the role is truly designed to do? Yep. And how do we take some of that burden and put it where it should be appropriately placed? Yeah. Tell me how you feel about that, and just how you feel about the workload and the experience and the situation, especially as somebody that has to train these folks and recruit these folks. What is your experience, or how do you feel about it?
I mean, the job has never been harder. And this is just, if we look at call volume and just the amount of officers we have on the streets, how hard they work, and the great job they do day in and day out, because they really do. I'm impressed with everybody. I think back to when I first came on, and I knew what an average call per shift was to where we're at right now. Right? I mean, we run, and a lot of stuff is just some of it's silly, right? But there's plenty of serious calls that are happening out there too. But we're starting to see it's a hard job. And if pull up the Argus Leader today, and one of the main articles that pops up is restaurant workers desperate for help, right? So what I'm going to say next is there's a shortage of workforce right now, right?
Period.
Right? And then you take some of the national climate and say, okay, well, who wants to be a cop right now? Right?
Yeah.
Has anybody said that at home or in conversations?
Yeah.
Because I'm like, yeah, I'm kind of stuck, no, for real.
Right.
But it's like,
Right.
people are like, yeah, I don't know, I would go to the store. I'm like, man, I would not want your job right now.
Yeah.
It's the comment that comes up quite a bit.
Yeah.
Right. So we are this has happened before. We're in a period where it's harder to recruit, and get applicants. But we want people to know, on a side note, as I look into the camera, Sioux Falls Police is hiring. We want the best and brightest. Please come right now. We'd love to have you. Because it really is like we want people for our organization because we're a great organization. But you're right, Bonnie. Like all these things that are taking place. But here's kind of what came out of the summer for me. And I listened to a lot of things get said, and it's whether it's defund the police or what needs to be different or what should change. Well, if you could present to me something right now that'll show me how we don't have to send our officers to mental health calls or addiction, or how we can cut into that, right? You know what I mean? Hey, I would love to read that document, but we're too busy to invent that while we're taking all these calls, right? For anybody else, right? So I think the conversation, it comes back to like the polarizing defund thing, right?
Yeah.
So is there a way to take law enforcement job and make it a little leaner, right? More towards its intended purpose sometimes by using community resources. Like I said, if there was a way to make a solid impact on addiction calls and mental health calls, you would see calls handled by the Sioux Falls Police diminish significantly, which is why with the opening of the link, which we've worked with, because many times who's the front door to these types of services? It's the front door is sometimes the back door of a cop car. I don't know if anybody's ever said that before, but I'd like to trademark that and make that.
I haven't heard that before, but it's catchy.
Okay, right?
So.
But it is the front door to services, right? So if we're bringing people in, finding a way as a community to do things that impact that keep law enforcement maybe more towards issues that need more law enforcement care. And sometimes crazy ideas really have, pretty amazing impact. Like you even look at like Project Safe House, right? Which, if you're not familiar with, is a facility that's designed for serial inebriates to stay at, and they manage some of their alcohol issues and they do different things. Well, that had a definite impact on how many calls officers were then dealing with those individuals, right? And so I think there's good ideas to be had out there, and they're not necessarily going to come all from law enforcement. They're going to come from the community and how we work together to come up with some of these ideas. And also, back to your piece, which you always hit on so nicely, but I have to be a little more diplomatic when I say it.
I take care of it.
Yeah, you take care of it, which is calling the police when appropriate and not calling the police when you just want to solve your grass problem or some silly problem with your neighbor. And I
think we have to say that because it's not just like that you don't get to look to your city to settle disputes or whatever, but like it should be after you talk to your neighbor. You should know your neighbor.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes when people do those things and they pick up the phone to call somebody for that thing, they don't think that when they're doing that, that's what's keeping that officer from being able to get out of their car to go talk to those kids or go talk to that new American or go talk to that person and develop a relationship with them so that way we can actually do something about these things. They don't think about that. They don't think about the reason why it's so hard to get a diverse police department is because we're outpacing the amount of people that we can even get in, much less be able to support and get people from other communities to be able to come here. And I think there's a mindfulness that has to happen for people in terms of the part that you play or don't play. And quite honestly, inaction, I think, is the most unacceptable action.
You talk about moments for those officers to make those inroads, and I think. We've tried to do a good job of empowering our officers to do that, not necessarily when it's part of a program, right? But as part of their day-to-day activities. Found out about an event in one of the middle schools this year where the SROs would take kids out and for experiences as simple as getting a haircut, going to a restaurant, and going to Shields to get some clothes, right? Like just very simple events in a life. And this whole program was built out of an officer's idea. How can I make impacts with kids? Right? And he didn't ask for permission. He just did it because that's where he wanted to make his inroads with those kids. And such amazing things have come out of this, where a kid who's never had a haircut in a salon, right, or a barber shop. Sorry. Right. My mom took me to her salon when I was a kid. So
my wife works at a salon, so I support all the salons out there.
Right. A kid who had never ate in a restaurant where someone actually served him, right, where it wasn't fast food or it wasn't that, and just the ability to go out and buy some new clothes at Shields. Now, this is just a very simple event in a day, but it's an interaction between an officer and a kid that becomes this anchor point, and it all comes out of the officer's desire to make an impact within his community, which is his
Let me just hit this real quick, because it's not just, a simple thing, and because again, when we look at what happened in the mall that night, most of those people were young, right? And we live in a world where like people can all get behind taking care of kids, right? We need to take care of kids. We need to protect kids. We need to invest in kids. We need to do these type of things. The unfortunate part about it is that we love kids until they grow up.
My mom still loves me.
You know what I mean? Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, if that young person doesn't have that experience, that exposure, that connection, that whatever, if that person doesn't have that, that's the same person you're dealing with at 22. That person is still acting out in the same way. If that energy doesn't get, it's inertia. If that doesn't get interrupted by equal or opposite force, that trajectory is set. And so how many kids are walking past? And I think about those young folks, because there's a lot of young folks that were out there that are dealing with some of the repercussions of that still to this day, that we got a chance to talk to, and we sat down with, and we had lunch with, and we said, what was going on through your mind? Why did you choose this way? But there's a lot of powerful people in here. There's a lot of powerful people watching. How many people even gave two thoughts about those kids outside of whatever post they wrote about it? How many people investigated the circumstances in which they came from to say, how do we resource their schools? How do we develop more dynamic programs? How many of them were saying, why do our children feel this way about our community? Like, people didn't challenge themselves in that way. And that is something that it's telling, to be perfectly honest with you. Now, that's not the full story. There are awesome programs. We just had our new state's attorney be inducted. And one of the things that, he's been a prominent supporter of is more adult diversion type situations, things that we didn't have. How do we keep people from being in the system? We're still in a situation where we spend $22,000 housing an inmate and less than $10,000 educating our children. What? It makes no sense whatsoever. For me, I believe the community has to participate in that in a huge way. We do Leaders of Tomorrow. We try to develop leaders as best we can, trying to get it as young as we can, because I think people need to intentionally try to develop folks, because they don't develop themselves, and you don't fix people, you develop them. And for us, particularly with Think 3D being Black men that own an organization, that's something that we are extremely passionate about. But there's some other things too, though, that I just like to think about, because there's some things I like to see happen. I like to see some of those jobs that we talked about. Maybe they don't leave the police, but maybe there's opportunity to have someone who's not necessarily gun and badge do some of those things. Maybe have a pathway for those folks to be able to, non-traditional folks to be able to become police officers, because a lot of times people say, well, why don't you have more diversity? And one of the things people got to understand is that you're already drawn from a very small percentage. And then from that, once you go through the process, it's a very, very small percentage. And so when you're operating from a starting place of 20%, 22% diversity, it's very, very difficult. And then, like you said, they're not beating down the door.
No. And you come back to that, and it's like, okay, well, the real simple answer is, well, we can do a press release.
Right.
And in that press release, it'll say we're looking to hire great qualified officers, more diversity, this, then we can let the press release fly, and absolutely nothing will happen.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's just not, like, we just you can't make a press release and happen. So different ideas and different things that are being proposed. We're currently working right now on a community service officer model, which is basically, other cities around the country have them, where these are non-armed officers, right? we were looking for a new name. We decided community care officers. None of this is final, but like we were trying to make a point, playing with the words a little bit to say, okay, these are our officers that are going to go out and enforce some of these minor issues, but also become more of a way to get people into the Sioux Falls Police Department, comfortable with their environment, understanding how the whole system works, and then create identity within different parts of the community. Because the reality is that it's just not that easy to do a press release and bring people in. And even as you bring people in, right, how do we make sure that they're comfortable with who we are as an organization, understand they're part of that organization, and then work to do that. And on top of that, we need to find a way to partner, because again, the Sioux Falls Police Department can again send press release after press release, but how are we partnering with the community to say, hey, this is who we believe would be a great police officer, and like, oh, how can we work with you to realize that and understand that that's not going to happen tomorrow, right? This may be the 16-year-old, 15-year-old kid, right, who now we're building these positive interactions, a sense of community mindedness, and understand, hey, this is a possibility for me to serve my community as a police officer, and how do I get to that road, right? How do I get there? Now I've got a couple paths, it's military, college, community care officer program. There's different things that will say, okay, how can we open up to find different pathways to get a broader spectrum of the community involved in our police department? And I think it comes back to simple acts, even before all those programs start, or different things. And I think people want to find some complex or impactful way to make an impact in kids' lives. But I'll steal this from my pastor. He said in church a couple weeks ago, sometimes it's not what you do, but it's how you do it that matters more, right? So maybe it's not like this super complex program, right? Or having the right words to say, but being present and with a giving heart and a heart that's for your community, and working within kids' lives with different aspects of your community to say, how can we push this forward a little bit? Because you're not going to have, we're not all going to have the right words. We're not going to have, we will have the right heart and the right mindset to guide people and to work within our community.
We had the opportunities, obviously the Mayor's Initiative, Sioux 52, our Rotary is participating in that in a significant way. If you don't have a mentor, a mentee or a mentor, find one, get one, like create those relationships, start making those connections, start feeding into people, start actually, participating in that way. It all doesn't have to be a Herculean effort. It all doesn't have to be this huge thing. It's just making consistent and constant contributions to move this thing forward, and it can be done. A couple other things. First of all, I really like the idea of that program for a couple different reasons, because one in particular is just because I think having that kind of junior officer, that road, gives people, I think, that training of communication and de-escalation and being able to do all those other type of things, because that is such a valuable tool, and it's the most valuable tool.
Yeah, the best training I had for law enforcement was working at the Hy-Vee meat counter at 33rd Minnesota.
I remember when you worked there.
Yeah, so I worked there at Hy-Vee for 10 years, most through high school, all the way through college, right up until I got this police job. And I love that job so much that I'm like, when I get off my year probation, I'm gonna go back and work at that meat counter, because that was, I liked having just one job.
Right,
I was like, hey, this is pretty cool. But dealing with, and again, I think sometimes we're losing that. It's all customer service. I don't care what field you're in, it all comes back to customer service in one way, shape, or form. It's not so much how you do or what you say, but how you do it really that matters more. And even if you think about working at the meat counter. So somebody come up, I'd see them when they're happy, because who's not happy when they're buying steak? Like a lot of people, right? Yeah. I'd see them when they're mad, when things didn't turn out the way they wanted to do. But you see repeat clientele, you'd see a whole different community would center around that grocery store.
Yeah.
And that's where I learned to talk to people, to deal with conflict, to deal with my coworkers who came from a very broad variety of life, everything from a recovering meth addict, right?
Yeah.
To a guy that ended up, pre-med people, and just the whole broad spectrum in between. And I think how we build interactions and chances for people, whether it's in that job or looking out for ways to interact and gain that experience. I mean, that's the best training you can get.
Yeah.
Sometimes the hardest thing is we come in with just a college degree, and anybody who runs a business knows this too. So I hire somebody and all they have is a college degree and really no life experience.
Yeah.
Well, now we got to teach them life experience while they work for us, right? And
that's harder to teach.
That's harder to teach.
Yeah.
Like the sheet of paper was actually easier,
Much.
than the communication skills and life experience that you get sometimes. And so I'm not downplaying college. If anyone, I'm just saying there's multiple pieces to the equation as to what makes a successful, employee. And I think that's something we can look at.
Let me ask you this. What do you think about the idea of community advisory type group or things of that nature? Because like you pointed out, it's so hard to develop these innovations while you're tasked with the job, right?
Yeah.
And I think one of the challenges when we think about policing is so much of it is about the book, right? Was it by the book or was it by the book? Most of the people in the community have no idea what's in the book. They have no idea how it got there, how it was vetted, whether or not it should still be there, or any of those other type of things. And so normally when something happens, that doesn't really quell anything or help anyone. Is there a space to have official capacity for the community to participate in developing these things or ideas? Because I do think it's, a kind of an unrealistic notion to, and all of you probably experienced this in your workplaces. You'll have someone that is in a certain position that looks to leadership or whoever, and they're like, fix it. This is broke, fix it. As if they always know.
Yeah.
Especially when they're not the one closest to the issue. What are your thoughts on?
Again, part of the whole thing is absolutely listening, right? From the Community Ambassador Program to Citizens Police Academy to other, conduits down the road. But I think there's no such thing. I mean, well, there are bad ideas, but a spirit in a certain sense that every idea needs to be looked at and everything needs to be understood a little bit. Because even now, if you go to our webpage and go to the social justice portion of the Sioux Falls Police Department webpage, you can find all the policies, the book, right, on numerous things that people would find interesting, from use of force to mobile field force or specialty units, just stuff like that, like where you can find answers to those questions. Well, that came out of listening to people because we hadn't really been putting that stuff out there before. Right. And other things, this 6-part video series that it was 6 parts, right? That our community resource officers put out. Like that's from listening to the community and say, here's some questions we have about these different aspects of the police department. Well, let's make a video and let's put it out and let's address some of these questions. If we're not listening to the feedback that we're getting, like any business, we're not really setting ourselves up for success. And to find, again, I think a lot of stuff tends to funnel through the mayor's office. A lot of stuff tends to funnel through different spots, but some ideas never even get to the point where they're presented to anybody.
Right.
It's just a rallying cry or a yelling point.
Right. It's just a thing that
just a thing. Like
nothing to really make it real. Side note, one of the things that you could do as soon as you get done with this is go find those videos and share them. Right. Participate in making sure those things get circulation and that they get in front of people and we have a dialogue that way. I know for a fact we can eat up this time, no problem, but I promised myself I'll try to get in the question.
What time is it?
I'm
not looking at my watch, Bonnie. I got
Oh, you gonna do that to me? Right?
It's because it's in my pocket. I can't go for my phone, right? I don't have.
So we got the mic there. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. But if you did have a question that you kind of wanted to throw at us, if you could find your way to the microphone, we'd love to hear it. Otherwise, we will keep talking. So if you're not familiar with me, okay.
Should I do this?
You do
There we go.
Yes.
Thank you both for the conversation today. I can't appreciate it enough. You talked about videos, and I think about hitting the youths and how many of them are not on Facebook anymore.
Yes.
And the police department has done such a fantastic job of like embracing social media over the years. Do you have a TikTok account? What are your plans for the future? Do you need help?
I knew you were going to ask that, right? And so
I know you did.
Came up and started saying, and again, it's something that we have to look at. I mean, how we can't look at it from perspective of 41-year-old guy, right?
Yeah.
Right. Who really, I mean, after
I would love to see your TikTok.
I don't have a tab. Sure, it'd be good. I mean, but it's like, okay, I can look at it from my perspective as a 41-year-old guy.
Yeah.
Who really is maybe social media. I'm okay with it, but I'm not I'm not going to put a lot of my anything personally on there. But yeah, if I ignore the fact that everybody's communicating by TikTok, then I'm really probably not being an effective communicator for that generation, right? I'm not finding a way to reach that out. Now, and then it becomes, you know, kind of a line between, well, what's too silly for law enforcement and what, you know, like you do something and it offends one generation, right? You do something else and the other generation approves it. You know, how could the police, I mean, that mannequin challenge video we did, which is now like old news, right?
Yeah.
People hated us for it and they loved it for us.
I love it. Here's the thing,
Yeah.
like you still have a gun. Like you're gonna be serious. Like I'm you know what I mean? Like I'm still gonna take you serious even if you
No,
you know,
but you're right. We have to be, because we need a marketing side, a marketing mindset,
messaging,
you know, and how we're messaging that. And if, again, I was just listening to one of my supervisor of the PD, he coaches a youth soccer team of immigrant refugee kids, right? And he can't even call them to pick them up for practice. He has to Snapchat them, right? Because that's how they communicate. They don't have a phone number, they have a Snapchat. And so, again, listening to the community, saying, how do you want your police department to interact with you? And maybe begrudgingly we'll get a TikTok account at some point, right? You know, because that's the way that those kids want to communicate with us. Now, again, too, it sounds like one of those things that's the easy button again, right?
For sure.
Right. Well, that's just one piece of many pieces that get put together. But if we're not having those meaningful interactions, I still think you can corporately all you want talk about relationships, but relationships are built right here.
100%.
Right.
Because even that piece is not like it's just like you get a Snapchat. There's still policy around it. What can you put on there? What can you not put on there? When are you does the person want to be on there or whatever? Are you exploiting kids? There's a lot of conversations within that, but that's what I mean. Like those are also community conversations to be had where it's not what's the idea, but also giving thought to how we execute that idea, the manner in which we want that thing to happen, you know? And that's why it's such a challenge for me, or my challenge to the community is to say, like, why would we be having a conversation about national politics that don't really affect us? When we get done with the conversation, absolutely zero would have changed. And I see people engaging in these conversations all of the time. But there's some of those same people would not fire a brain cell as to figure out how we come together and touch these people and educate these people and lift these people and all of those other type of things. And that is sad to me. Now, what I will say is that I don't necessarily think that is the entire picture. But in our situation, I think the thing that I'm really fearful for us is complacency. Yeah. Because good is the greatest impediment to great. And we have a pretty good city. But it should be excellent. And we can be better in many areas. And that's what I'm excited to see us do.
Sorry, one more comment, then we'll get back to you. Like, if we look at our city, right, we stand on the cusp of we are transitioning into this metro area. Whether people want it or not, we are a metropolitan area. And we look at our projected growth over the next 10 years, somebody could probably give me the numbers, but 3,000 to 5,000 people per year, is that a safe estimate? Especially
that's probably getting low now.
Right, getting low, right? So let's just think about that growth and where we're going to be 10 years from now. And the reality is that, I mean, 10 years could be the span of my career. I could be out of here by then, right? And you could be, I don't know where you'll be by then.
I'm going to be on the
beach somewhere, right? Right? But we're all going to move forward, and behind us comes that next group of people who are going to carry the mantle. But what are we handing to them?
Correct.
Right? Are we handing to them something we just complacently kind of chugged along because we thought it was good enough? Or are we handing something that they can build from? Because we're always going to be building on our predecessors and building towards the next.
And are we handing it to them, or we just drop it? You know? Yes.
I am this tall. This actually is my question. My sons are 6 and 10. What does Sioux Falls look like for them when they're the 41-year-old guy sitting in the chair? What are we building it all to?
Yeah.
And what's the one thing each of in this room today can do to help be a part of the Rotary community that gets them there?
Yeah. All right, I'll say this, I'll let you have the last word.
Yeah.
So for me, I do think it'll be significantly different for them. You know, they're coming up in a world where diversity is natural to them. It's not something that's jarring. One thing living here, I have developed a empathy for is when your world changes, people respond a certain way, good, bad, or indifferent. When your world is changing, it can be jarring for you. You know, it's not your father Sioux Falls. It's not your grandfather Sioux Falls, right? And for some people, whether it's better or worse, it's still jarring. And for a lot of people, they're starting to be able to become more natural. So I think that's a big thing. So I do think things will be better that way. In terms of what we're handing them and how we're setting them up, I do feel like there's programs and things that are happening, but what I need from people, what I'm asking for is some real significant urgency. And the reason why I say that is because 2025, we're losing 10,000 boomers every day in the workforce in positions of leadership. 2025 is the critical mass generationally. The greatest changeover of wealth, power, and responsibility this world has ever seen is upon us. And we're going to be doing the handover. We're going to be doing the changeover. So if you're not working to reach out to people, develop people, make them, if that's not something that is at the very, very, very top of your list, you have to understand, just because when your hands are not on the wheel, you're still going to be in the car. So you had better prepare the next set of drivers. That has to be something that is paramount. Our investment needs to reflect it. Our time needs to reflect it. Our dialogue needs to reflect it. If you're back and forth with somebody in a negative way, and it's not about how we make our community excellent, if it's not about how we have the best police department, I'm not interested in finding villains or victims in this particular situation, right? I'm not interested in that conversation at all. It's only the thing for me. And so for me, I'm not sitting here trying to find what's wrong with our police department. I'm saying, are we the best police department on the planet Earth? No, then there's stuff for us to do. Do we have the best community connections possible? No, then there's stuff for us to do. Our clergy and those type of things back in the game. Is that I know CEOs that own companies that are having Bible studies like they're underground fight clubs because they're weird about having a, listen, people got to come outside and you can worry about being canceled or saying something that people don't like. Suck it up. If bad press is the worst you got to deal with, consider that a privilege. Get in the game, do something, participate. There is no excuse not to. And if you're having a conversation in a political context, Republicans do this, Democrats do this, liberals do that, you are contributing to the problem. No one owns virtues. No one has ownership on principles. If you care about families, if you care about community, if you care about growth, if you care about business, if you care about development, get in the game and do something. That's my thing.
Can I go first?
You're done. We're technically over time.
Oh, sorry about that.
I mean, you can go.
No, so it's a great question because my kids are 10, 9, and 7, right? And I think we're all looked at, and we've done a great job within the police department from chief after chief, that who's next, right? Next person up. Who's behind you to pick up the work that needs to be done and what needs to be taken care of. And I think we can look at that as a community as well, because yeah, absolutely. If I look at my kid's class at Susan B. Anthony when he was a kindergartner, and I was like, that class is 50% diverse.
Yeah.
Right? I'm like, Sioux Falls is a town that is growing, it's changing, and every year is a little bit different. And so how am I embracing each part of the community, looking who's there, and looking at what our impact is? And again, I think there's so much pressure and stress to say, okay, what I have to do something that's just super impactful that everybody will recognize as this great thing. And it has to be this really slick program. But the reality is when I look back at what you did, just have done something. Mm-hmm. Like just rather than spinning your tires in the sand or the mud of what this great thing I have to do, just do something on a regular basis. You know, whether that's just taking 1 little minute out of your day to interact with a kid or a person that's different than you, or listening to a different perspective. Back to your point, I just challenge you, like, it's not always political, right? Mm-hmm. You said, like, go to multiple news sources in a day, not just one, right? Look at a broad perspective. So at least if I don't maybe I don't agree with that viewpoint that you have, but at least I understand where it's coming from. And that's a better foundation to have a conversation than just to bang our heads against the wall because we both think something different. And I think that's how we impact our community. Again, there's big things to be done, but there's little things to be done on a regular basis that really have lasting impact.
Awesome. Yep. Appreciate you, man. Yep. Thanks for doing it.
Yep.
I do want to go on the record and say that the overage part was his part. I ended on time.
I think
Well, Lieutenant Thum and Rotarian Vaney, thank you for joining us today in an important conversation that's ongoing. And I think that's what struck me the most is how often you guys are bringing up how we as a society love easy answers. We tweet the easy answer, we Snapchat the easy answer, but nothing about this is easy, but it is urgent. So thank you for joining us today. Our next meeting will be June 7th, where we will be discussing immigration challenges and opportunities. We look forward to having you all there then. And then also beginning June 7th, our next meeting, we will be back to a buffet style lunch. So that's the next step in our back to normal. So thank you, everybody. This meeting is adjourned.